All right, good evening, folks. It's Enforcer Matt, and welcome back to another Short War Summary. And today we have some pretty big news coming out about the F-16 fighter jets allegedly going to Ukraine a lot sooner than expected, and also in a pretty large number. We're also receiving some pretty big news about Ukrainian attacks on Russian airfields and bases, and we've learned more information about what has been destroyed on those bases. So let's go ahead and jump right into our first news article of the day, which is from the Kyiv Independent. And it's a statement from Zelensky. Zelensky says Ukraine is going to get 42 F-16 fighter jets, a very big number and almost identical to what Ukraine asked for originally when the whole F-16 situation got started. We also see here that President Zelensky said on August 20th that Ukraine would get 42 jets after training for Ukrainian pilots and engineers is completed, according to his agreement with the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, and quote-unquote, Zelensky says, this is only the beginning. And undoubtedly, this is very positive news, and Zelensky also feels very positive about it as well, because he says this is only the beginning, so very good news here. But the big question is, and this statement right here kind of highlights that, is how soon are these jets actually going to arrive in Ukraine for them to be used? And Zelensky kind of left us with a vague statement. He said after training for Ukrainian pilots and engineers is completed. So once again, what we've heard from the U.S. is it's going to take about a year or so. The earliest that Ukraine will receive the jets should be summer of 2024. That's according to the U.S., but we have received a statement from the Defense Minister of Ukraine, Reznikov, today that could be changing pretty quickly. So let's go ahead and jump right into our next article, which is from Ukrainian Front. And this is that statement from the Defense Minister of Ukraine. He said, Ukrainian pilots, engineers, and technicians began training on F-16 aircraft, and the program also includes English language courses, and the minimum expectation for receiving aircraft by Ukraine is 6 months. So obviously, that is basically cutting the American timeline in half, and he's saying it's going to take probably about 6 months. And at this point, we haven't seen anything publicly rather than this statement to say that is actually the case. But considering Zelensky's very positive statements about this only being the beginning, I wouldn't put it past that it might only take 6 months, and maybe they know something that we don't behind the scenes, and hopefully it is actually that quick, because the sooner Ukraine gets their hands on these jets, the faster they can turn this war around in their favor in a big way. So, very positive news, and I'm glad to hear it. And moving into our next post here, we have one from Clash Report, and we have a statement from the commander of the Ukrainian Air Force about the F-16s. We see that they made 3 statements here. The first being Ukrainian pilots already have experience in operating the F-16. Ukraine has conducted joint exercises with the pilots of these fighters, and the Ukrainian side is preparing the runways. And the big statement here to me is that Ukraine has begun preparing the runways for accommodating these F-16 jets, which has been a point of contention about them receiving the jets the entire time. Many people have argued that the F-16 has very lightweight and fragile landing gear, which it does, but the question is, can the Ukrainian runways handle these jets so that way they can take off and land without sustaining massive damage to the aircraft itself? And with this statement that Ukraine has begun preparing the runways, I think it's clear that Ukraine is making some pretty big strides to prepare for the delivery of these aircraft, and that it will be sooner than later that they receive them, or otherwise they wouldn't have started this work already. So, good news to hear, and with that being said, let's go ahead and move into our next news article, and this one is from Null Reports. And we see here that Zelensky is in the cockpit of one of the exact F-16 fighter jets that the Netherlands will supply to Ukraine, and the fella next to him is the Lieutenant General Andre Stuur, and hopefully I'm saying that last name properly, and he is the commander of the Royal Dutch Air Force. And we see here Zelensky is very exuberant and jubilant sitting in this F-16. Understandably so. He almost looks like he's looking at a new car, which is kind of funny. But this jet right here, he knows is going to be very influential in the war, and it's going to make Ukraine a power to be reckoned with and put some fear in the Russians. As we've already seen, the Russians don't want Ukraine to get their hands on these jets, and they've called the jets a quote-unquote nuclear threat because they know how potent they can be. So good to see Zelensky's out here checking out the jets himself, and good to see that the Netherlands is going out of their way to help provide these jets. And moving on to our next post here, we have one from Anton Gerashenko, and we're switching gears just a little bit. Last night, we did hear about an attack on a military airfield in Soltsy in the Novgorod region of Russia, and this post from Gerashenko says that the Russian channels published photos of an alleged burning Tu-22M3 supersonic bomber, which was reportedly destroyed yesterday by drone. And eyewitnesses reported 2 aircraft were allegedly struck, one suffered less damage, and the other burned down completely. And in these images here, you can see that there is definitely an aircraft underneath that fire, And the fire is rather massive, by the way. A lot of black smoke coming up from that. And here is a sideways view of it as well. And you can see a fuselage there sticking out of the blaze. So, a very big achievement by Ukraine to destroy one of those supersonic bombers. That is definitely a positive thing for Ukraine. And also, this proves to be one of Ukraine's longest ever drone attacks that they've conducted throughout the entire war, proving that they can reach farther than ever before expected. And with that being said, moving on to our next post here, we have a post from Flash News Ukraine, and this is kind of a funny story if you ask me. Roscosmos, which is the Russian version of NASA, reported that the first Russian mission to the moon never reached its goal, and quote-unquote, the Luna 25 station went into an uncalculated orbit and collided with the moon. Thus, the mission ceased to exist, said a statement from Roscosmos. And this is rather funny because the Russians launched this mission to try to distract from their failings in Ukraine, and they hoped that this would prove some kind of distraction or propaganda to make the Russian public think that everything's fine, everything's going okay. But now we've learned, in translating this very wordy statement right here, that it crashed and it got destroyed and it didn't make it to the moon in the way it expected. It made it there in pieces. So it was a failure on Russia's part. And obviously, this is going to be an embarrassment for Russia, and other states are going to try to do the same thing. I think India is the next place trying to do the same thing, and then the United States is sending their own mission back to the moon very soon. So the Russians are now out of the space race, if you could call it that at this point, and they never really had a chance to begin with. And moving on to our next post here, we have one from Nexta, and it says Ukrainian crop exports fell by a third after the resumption of the blockade of the Black Sea by Russia, writes Bloomberg. And Bloomberg also noted that exports via alternative routes have proved challenging, and the sales of grain are a key source of income for Ukraine. And even though the alternative routes are still proving challenging, I'm hopeful that the Black Sea blockade, being a somewhat selective blockade, isn't going to keep affecting the crop exports in the way that Ukraine sees it currently. And I have a feeling that unless it's a small vessel flagged out of a small country with basically no military, I think most of the grain vessels will make it through because Russia isn't going to risk causing a major war over some grain exports in the Black Sea. I really doubt that. So hopefully this will turn around for Ukraine in their favor. And moving on to our next post here, we have one from Euromaidan Press. And we learned some more news about Putin and Xi's relationship, the quote-unquote no-limits relationship. And they said shipments of dual-use goods from China to Russia soared several times, bringing the trade between countries to a record high. And China has also exported some products to Russia through third countries to avoid sanctions, including turbojets, missile navigation systems, and possibly titanium alloy products. And to me, to say these are dual-use goods is kind of a stretch because turbojets, missile navigation systems, etc., those really aren't dual-use. Those are pretty much clearly military in my opinion. And China is doing that to support Putin's genocide in Ukraine because these two guys right here are pretty evil. They run authoritarian states, and they're not interested in human rights or anything to that effect, quite obviously. And they're looking to try to crush the West by trying to defeat Ukraine and go from there. So, not good to see that China is still helping out Russia in a big way. And they're doing it very sneakily, which causes some people to get confused. They're not sure if China's really helping out or not. But it is pretty clear at this point that China has been, and they're doing nothing really to stop the help that they're providing to Russia because they're sanctioning it themselves from the state to the bottom. So, moving on to our next post here, we have one from Ukrainska Pravda in English. It says the EU may impose sanctions on Poland if the embargo on Ukrainian grain is not lifted. And obviously, the Polish farmers are saying that the imports from Ukrainian grain supply is hurting their economy. And not getting into the politics of it, but I will say that Poland, being a large supporter of the war in Ukraine's favor, should not have to sit here and be imposed sanctions from the EU to make them accept grain from Ukraine. I think that is a bad thing because if Polish population starts not supporting the war in Ukraine, that could lead to a total loss of support, which would cause catastrophic results on the Ukrainian war effort. So this right here, I'm going to leave it up to you what you think about it, and I'm going to stop right there before I get into the politics of the situation. And moving on to our last post of the day, we have one from Politico Europe. It says, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many Western companies left the Russian market entirely, and those who stayed now face having their assets seized or collaborating with the regime. And to me, I would say these companies honestly kind of deserve this, because if they're still operating inside of Russia and accepting Russian money in the midst of this genocide in Ukraine that Russia is conducting, that is not good, and they're placing money over morals and everything else. And if they get taken over by the Russian state, and they get what's coming to them. Like this caption says right down here, the longer you dance with the devil, the more likely you are to get burned. And a lot of people have gotten burned. For example, Danone right here, which is a French food manufacturer, they got taken over by Russia, and Kadyrov's son got put in charge of it, which is basically a thug. So now he's in charge of Danone, and they make food for the Russians now. And they've been basically pushed out of the area Danone has. So, you know, if these companies are stupid enough to stay here in the midst of the war, they get what's coming to them. But with that being said, that is our last piece of news for the day. I hope you found this video informative, and if you have, please press a like on the video, and please subscribe as well. And we post these videos daily as the news comes out. We also have a news war live stream at 10 p.m. Eastern every single night. You can join us there as well. And also go peep our Twitter page. Our Twitter handle is @It'sTheEnforcer. And we also have a Patreon. The link is in the description below, where you can help support us and keep us doing these videos. So thank you all for watching, and bye-bye for now.